Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hujiwana and today we're asking the question, why are sci-fi aircraft so weird? And possibly even answering it as well. First though, we're going to demonstrate what I mean by weird with some examples. To start with, we have the advanced fighters from Stealth, the FA-37 Talon and the even more high-tech Extreme Deep Invader. The first of those is a perfect example because it has all the wacky fictional plane stuff. It's got funky aerospike engines fed by air intakes on the top of the fuselage, forward-swept wings that also fold forward for hypersonic flight, and even lift jets for low-velocity flight, which it naturally doesn't use for carrier landings or takeoffs. As we can see, it has so many features it ends up working at odds with reality and even itself, like having old-fashioned sweeping wings for low-speed flight when it has guided weapons and VTOL jets that render those unnecessary. And we know they're unnecessary because Eddie, the AI-flown jet, works just fine with no sweeping wings at all. But Eddie has his own issues, like the downward curving blended body and wings, like a death glider from Stargate. And just like the F-302 from that franchise, those heavily drooping wingtips are really close to the ground. One hard landing that pushes the suspension up and bam, no more wingtips. Oh, and both aircraft are naturally invisible to radar, as the name of the film suggests, just like the MiG-31 Firefox, but that thing has the distinction of predating real stealth. The F-117 Nighthawk hadn't even flown when the book the film was based on was written, let alone being made public. But there were rumours swirling about the possibility of stealth, leading to the famous and fictitious F-19 stealth fighter, a speculative version of what the US Air Force might have been coming up with. The Firefox having stealth, a word that might not have even been attached to low radar observability yet, was kinda crazy. I can't talk about fictional aircraft without bringing up Ace Combat, which has many fictional fighters known for four things: missile spam, canopyless cockpits, canards, and forward-swept wings. The first one is a gameplay thing, so whatever, hand wave that away, but the other three are very much deliberate style choices, and let's talk about them. Canopyless, or fully enclosed cockpits, replace the transparent canopy with screens and cameras and other sensors. It's a very cool and clearly futuristic concept, though I don't know if this or the F-35 helmet display thing is better in terms of practicality. At least the F-35 has a low-tech backup. The other two, canards and forward-swept wings, go hand in hand with one another as they are both features that increase the maneuverability of aircraft. Wing sweep has all sorts of impacts on stability and control, and canards are just extra control surfaces so their impact is fairly obvious. They've been used on many real-world in-service fighter aircraft for that reason. As for forward-swept wings, they've been the subject of a number of experimental aircraft, notably the X-29 and Su-47, but thrust vectoring and a general shift away from dogfights to long-range missile combat meant this was a bit of an evolutionary dead end. Super cool in Ace Combat though, these features have really become a bit of a staple of the series. And now for an outlier, Top Gun's Dark Star, which isn't weird at all. This is thanks to being made in collaboration with Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, and being based on the really real SR-71 and conceptually real SR-72. Skunkworks even made a full-scale mock-up with some real instruments and controls in the cockpit. This makes it one of the more, I don't want to say realistic, but authentic fictional aircraft out there. So much so that its full-sized mock-up famously caused a Chinese spy satellite to change its orbit to get photos of it, presumably because they thought it might have been real when it was just a prop. Or was the whole thing an elaborate misdirect? Either way, it's a really cool craft, and one that's definitely had an influence, as we can see from this Lego spaceship. Now we lurch unceremoniously to Caprica, the offshoot prequel for Battlestar Galactica, which featured propeller and jet engine powered predecessors to the Viper. These took the idea of recognizable vehicle evolution a little bit too far, forcing the familiar shape of the Viper on aircraft styles that don't really work with it. Propeller aircraft are very different to jets, and jets are going to be different to future tech space-capable fighters. Something else that the show did is include a lot of VTOL jet aircraft, which is another very common design trope. But it doesn't just happen to purely fictional craft though. Real aircraft get made fictional when VTOL capability gets added to them, like the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. C-130, the C-5 from Team Knight Rider, or the SR-71 from X-Men First Class. And VTOL capability takes us to helicopters, which are also very subject to being made weird, possibly even more so than fixed-wing aircraft. Think of a sci-fi helicopter, and I bet it's not a normal configuration for a rotorcraft. It's surprisingly rare to see just a helicopter with one main rotor and an anti-torque system. Instead, fiction goes for something different, depending on how close to reality it wants to be. If it wants to be near future, then it'll pick coaxial rotors, two sets of counter-rotating main rotors that eliminate the need for an anti-torque system, which is a real thing, it's just rare. The Crisis sequels have these, as do the modern Deus Ex games, and Cyberpunk 2077's only rotorcraft is the Valgus, which you only ever see while landed on its extremely bizarre landing gear. Other common things seen are having the rotors on the sides and tilting them to transition to forward flight, which is another real thing. A related case is having tilt jets rather than tilt rotors, which has been experimented with, and maybe you could count Harriers and F-35s with their swiveling nozzles. Rotors on the sides, but they don't tilt, or having them be ducted fans or something, also happens a lot, most famously with the various aircraft seen in Avatar, but Halo's Falcon counts here too. To some degree, this is also what the MCU's Quinjets are. Normal choppers end up being fairly rare. There's a few in Ghost in the Shell and the Hunter chopper in Half-Life 2, and even that has the weird extra anti-torque rotor in the middle of it. You could argue for things like Blue Thunder and Airwolf, but those are just body kits on otherwise real helicopters. After helicopters, we get to the aircraft that make use of entirely different methods of flight, things like ornithopters. These flap their wings for locomotion, and the only real example are those from Dune, and even then the only good interpretation in my opinion are the ones from the Villeneuve movies. That switch to using vibrating insect wings rather than flappy bird ones was a stroke of genius. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all the more exotic methods of flight too, mainly the ones that just generate a floating force of some kind. Think of the hovercraft from The Matrix, or the repulsor tech from Star Wars, or just the general ubiquity of flying cars. But there's also the entire other end of the genre, the one that looks back and imagines an age where airships were actually useful. Typically, this is the realm of steampunk and alternate history or alternate reality, but airships do have their real-world uses, just not ones that sci-fi like to pretend they do. They're there to set a vibe, just like how flying cars set a vibe. They're meant to be weird and wonderful, but why do other fictional aircraft end up that way? I think it's a similar deal to sci-fi cars or tanks. There are certain design elements that show up repeatedly to indicate that this plane or helicopter is different or future-y. Forward-swept wings, hypersonic speed, tilt jets, ducted fans. They're not common in real life, if they exist at all, but they're so often there in the inspiration for these fictional vehicles. The real prototypes, the experimental craft, the near-future supposition about what's coming next. And that gets applied to a great many of these fictional aircraft as well. They're also often experimental prototype one-off superplanes, stuffed with all the crazy tech for cool features in the movie or game or whatever. This isn't always the case of course, but it does happen a fair bit. This particular bit of the trope seems to apply more to fixed-wing aircraft rather than rotary wings or equivalents. What I find interesting is that some real-life experimental concepts didn't end up with a fictional counterpart, like the cruciform rotor wing. This works like a helicopter main rotor for VTOL stuff, but locks into place mid-flight to become a wing. The oblique wing is a different take on the swing wing idea, where the whole wing, as one piece, changes its angle for low-speed or high-speed flight. Maybe these are just too specific or not known about, or a bit goofy feeling to end up in fiction. Or the idea is so new it simply hasn't percolated down to fiction creators yet, like Bell's high-speed vertical takeoff and landing idea, combining a tilt rotor and tilt jet engine into one thing. There's definitely some amazing potential for future sci-fi aircraft to be weird and wonderful, but there's already some very firm design trends throughout the genre. What are some of your favourite ones? Let me know in the comments below. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our Spacefighter design reference book. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.